The Communist Revolution that was victorious in China in 1949 remains one of the most important events in world history. The Chinese academic Mo Gao described the consequences of this revolution best when he wrote, "It was due to this revolution that the average life expectancy of the majority Chinese rose from 35 in 1949 to 63 by 1975, in a space of less than 30 years. It was a revolution that brought unity and stability to a country that had been plagued by civil wars and foreign invasions, and a revolution that laid the foundation for China to become the equal of the great global powers. It was a revolution that carried out land reform, promoted women's rights, improved popular literacy, and eventually transformed Chinese society beyond recognition." The Chinese Communist Revolution is perhaps the most successful revolution in history, and one of its most important leaders, as you all know, was Mao Zedong. However, the video is not about the achievements of the revolution, it is about whether Maoist China could be considered a socialist society in the Marxist-Leninist sense, what Marx and Engels would have called the lower stage of communism. I would say yes, even though I have some reservations. Let us start our investigation from the beginning. When the Chinese Communists came to power in 1949, China was not even close to being ready for communism. More than 80% of the Chinese population were rural peasants that lived in the countryside, and China's industrial capacity was similar to that of Belgium and the Netherlands, two tiny countries. So when the revolution was victorious, China simply lacked the industrial capacity to transition into a socialist society. As Engels writes in the Principles of Communism, quote, "No more than the existing forces of production can at one stroke be multiplied to the extent necessary for the creation of a communal society. In all probability, the proletarian revolution will transform existing society gradually and will be able to abolish private property only when the means of production are available in sufficient quantity." End quote. Marx in the German ideology also made it clear that moving to a communal society without building up the productive forces sufficiently would have disastrous results. Quote, "And on the other hand, this development of productive forces, which itself implies the actual empirical existence of men in their world historical instead of local being, is an absolute necessary practical premise, because without it, want is merely made general, and with destitution, the struggle for necessities and all the old filthy business would necessarily be reproduced." Here Marx made it clear that communism is not about being equally poor. In fact, Marx writes in the Critique of the Gotha program that the transition to the higher phase of communist society can only take place when the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly. To quote the paragraph in full, "In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-round development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right can be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribed on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need." End quote. Now the evidence suggests that Mao also believed this, as he stated in one of his early speeches to the country, So when the Communist Party came to power in 1949, they did not immediately seek to collectivize the entire economy and remove the capitalist class from industry. They believed that they needed the experience and technical expertise in order to lay the groundwork for the eventual transition to socialism. Of course, things were different in the countryside, where the landlords, who often lived off rent from hard-working peasants and were known for their utter cruelty, were treated far more harshly. Mao, writing in 1953, described the structure of the Chinese economy in the early years of Communist Party rule. The present-day capitalist economy in China is a capitalist economy, which for the most part is under the control of the people's government and which is linked with the state-owned socialist economy in various forms and supervised by the workers. It is not an ordinary but a particular kind of capitalist economy, namely a state capitalist economy of a new type. It exists not chiefly to make profits for the capitalists, but to meet the needs of the people and the state. True, a share of the profits produced by the workers goes to the capitalists, but that is only a small part, about 1/4 of the total. The remaining 3/4 are produced for the workers, in the form of the welfare fund, for the state in the form of income tax, and for expanding productive capacity, a small part of which produces profits for the capitalists. So according to Mao, in the early 50s, the Chinese economy was undeniably state capitalist. Now I, of course, tend to agree with this description. After all, in the early years of Communist Party rule, the number of businessmen actually increased in Maoist China. So in this early period, China was far from being a socialist country. However, in the later years, with the establishment of the communes and the end of the capitalist class in the cities, things were quite different. Despite the horrendous difficulties in the early years, the Maoists still managed to put China on the path to communism. This was especially evident with the creation of the People's Communes in the countryside and the abolishment of wage labour throughout the entire country. Let's start with looking at the urban centres, the cities. After the state capitalist period was over, private enterprises were collectivized, either turned into property owned by the people or workers' co-ops. Now, of course, bringing industries into state ownership does not make it socialist. However, there were a few key things that gave these industries a socialist character. One of the most important aspects was the end of labour power as a commodity. Marx writes in Capital Volume 1, "Otherwise with capital, the historical conditions of its existence are by no means given with the mere circulation of money and commodities. It can spring into life only when the owner of the means of production and subsistence meets in the market with the free labourer selling his labour power. And this one historical condition comprises a world history. Capital, therefore, announces from its first appearance a new epoch in the process of social production." In Chinese workplaces across the country, no such labour market existed. Workers had maximum job security and did not have to sell their labour power to an employer for a wage. This was similar to the Soviet Union, where labour power was also not a commodity. Chinese workers also enjoyed a right to housing, healthcare, and other basic needs. This was known as the Iron Rice Bowl. So wage labour as it exists under capitalism did not exist in China under the latter years of Mao. So you could say that workers were far more attached to the industries than they were under capitalism, where the threat of unemployment and destitution is very real. Furthermore, the surplus product was not appropriated by the capitalist class. Rather, it was directed towards improving the means of production, welfare for the people, see the Iron Rice Bowl, and other essential services. This is consistent with Marx. In the critique of the Gotha program, Marx writes, "Accordingly, the individual producer receives back from society, after the deductions have been made, exactly what he gives to it." So there will always be a surplus under socialism, for new means of production, and to maintain support for those who cannot work. Leftcoms, of course, seem to deny this. No surplus extraction exists under socialism, according to them. So no new industries and no support for those who cannot work. No resources for schools, etc. What a joke. The people's communes that dominated the countryside in China are perhaps the most significant examples of socialism in the Mao years. Whilst in the cities, workers tended to be paid in money wages. In the communes, workers receive labour tokens. Unlike money in capitalist society, These tokens in the communes did not circulate. They were like theatre tickets. Marx writes in Capital Volume 2, "The producers may, for all it matters, receive paper vouchers, entitled them to withdraw from the social suppliers of consumer goods a quantity corresponding to their labour time. These vouchers are not money. They do not circulate." End quote. In the Maoist communes, you saw what perhaps a future socialist society could look like, a society of associated producers where money is abolished, the means of production are held in common, and a common plan directed towards people's needs was in place instead of the market economy. Indeed, one of the great successes of the commune was the massive rise in life expectancy, since healthcare was a right, rather than a commodity. If you want to learn more about this period, I suggest Don Pinahan's Unknown Cultural Revolution, where he talks in great detail about life in Maoist China. So to conclude, how socialist was Maoist China? Well, production for need via a planned socialist economy had largely replaced production for profit. The capitalist class had been done away with, former capitalists being absorbed into the socialist society. The other form of property was co-ops. Labour power was no longer a commodity, and signs of money disappearing were there. So this was a socialist society that had developed out of a semi-feudal country that was once one of the poorest in the world. China's advance towards socialism resulted in the almost doubling of life expectancy and great economic construction.